For years, I had been paying for a house that, on paper, had never been mine. And what made it all so hard to accept wasn't that I didn't know from the beginning, but that I only realized it when the one person who should have told me was certain I would never find out. That morning, as I, Naomi Bennett, stood in my own familiar kitchen, my hand still clutching a coffee cup that had long gone cold, I thought I was starting just another ordinary day. Until Ethan Cole's voice drifted from the next room, clear enough that I didn't need to take another step to understand exactly what was happening. And when he said, "She doesn't need to know, it's already done," it was no longer a moment of suspicion or a vague premonition. It was the end point of everything I had been feeling for so long, but couldn't name. And in that very instant, not when I heard the words, but when I realized I wasn't surprised at all, I understood that some things had changed long before I ever saw them, and the only thing left wasn't the question of why, but a decision I knew I would have to make. And what makes this story different from what you might think is that I didn't say a single thing right then. I stood in the kitchen for a few more seconds, holding the coffee cup as if staying perfectly still could keep everything the same. The morning light slanted through the window, and everything around me was exactly as it was every other day. Only one thing had changed: the way I heard Ethan's voice from the other room. It was no longer the familiar words I'd heard for years, but something clearer, more direct, as if he no longer felt the need to hide. I realized I didn't have to move closer, didn't need to stand behind the door to hear better, because every word he spoke was enough to piece together a complete truth in my mind. When he said, "She doesn't need to know, it's already done," I didn't turn around, I didn't react, I didn't do anything to make that moment different. Because what stopped me wasn't the sentence itself, but an inexplicably familiar feeling, as if I had been in this situation before. I just had never looked at it head on. And in that moment, a thought surfaced with absolute clarity. This didn't surprise me. It only confirmed what I had been sensing for a very long time. I set the coffee cup down so gently it made no sound, and when he walked out a few minutes later, I was still standing there. I asked a perfectly normal question, listened to the answer, nodded at the right time. Everything flowed so smoothly that if anyone had been watching, they would never have guessed that just seconds before, my entire perception of my life had completely changed. And the only thing that was different was on the inside, where I had stopped waiting for an explanation and started to accept that I would have to find the answers myself for everything that came next. Before all of this, my life, from the outside, was unremarkable. There were no big arguments, no obvious signs of a problem brewing. Ethan and I lived in a stable rhythm. The same mornings, stress-free dinners, conversations, just enough to keep things moving. And if anyone had asked me then, I would have said I was in a normal marriage, not perfect, but good enough to continue. Because Ethan wasn't the kind of person who made you suspicious right away. His control wasn't rough or easy to spot. He didn't tell me what to do, didn't stop me from going out, didn't create clear boundaries. Instead, he was always the one who took care of things, the one who held the paperwork, the one who said, "Let me handle the complicated stuff," from contracts to finances. And for a long time, I saw that as support, as a form of caring, as his way of sharing a burden I didn't have to carry. And it was those small things. The times he said I didn't need to worry, the moments he signed for me because I was busy, the decisions made faster because he had already looked into it, that created a very natural sense of trust. Not because I couldn't do it myself, but because I thought I didn't have to. And that's how it was built, not with one big decision, but with hundreds of small details that made me gradually accustomed to not double-checking, not asking questions, not feeling the need to maintain control in places where I should have. It was only in looking back later that I realized something I had never considered before. He wasn't really controlling me. He was just controlling everything around me. And when everything around you is arranged in a certain way, you don't need to be controlled directly anymore because your choices have already been limited without you ever realizing it. Everything still looked completely normal until one afternoon when I opened the mailbox and saw an insurance envelope identical to so many I'd seen before. Nothing special about its appearance, no sense of urgency, just the kind of paperwork most people would quickly sign and forget. And if it had been a year earlier, I probably would have done the same. But that day, as I put it on the kitchen table and opened it, a very small detail made me pause longer than usual. It wasn't an obvious or shocking change, just a very slight deviation in how a name was written on the paper. An incomplete change, not big enough to raise immediate suspicion, but just enough to make someone like me, who was used to working with data, feel that something wasn't right. I remember standing still for a few seconds, my eyes fixed on that line of text for longer than necessary, as if waiting for it to explain itself. Of course it didn't. And then I folded the paper, set it on the table, and said nothing to Ethan when he walked into the kitchen later. I didn't ask any questions, didn't initiate a conversation that anyone else would have started right then, because I understood a very simple thing that my job had taught me over the years. The most dangerous things aren't the ones that change completely, but the ones that are just slightly off, small enough to be dismissed. And for that very reason, I didn't dismiss it. I just let it sit there in my mind, a very quiet but clear marker, because that was the moment I stopped believing what I was told and started paying attention to what was actually written on paper. I didn't know it then, but that was only the first sign, and what came after was what truly made it impossible for things to ever go back to the way they were. That night, when I opened my laptop and started reviewing the data, things were no longer just disconnected numbers. They began to connect into a meaningful chain. And as each line of information appeared before me, I wasn't just seeing the present. I began to remember moments from the past that I hadn't paid attention to before. The first time we moved into that house, the feeling of standing in the empty living room, my hand on the wall, thinking I had chosen the right place to start a new life. The times I personally picked out every little detail, from the paint color to the layout of the space. The evenings I sat alone in the kitchen, believing I was building something sustainable. And all those memories, when placed next to what I was seeing on the screen, began to change their meaning, not because they weren't real, but because my understanding of them had been wrong. And then I saw it, not a vague detail, but a clear fact. The house had been transferred, and my name was nowhere on the entire file. Not erased, not replaced, but had never existed in the first place. And there was a very long silence after I realized that, a silence where all thoughts seemed to stop to make way for a feeling that was hard to name. Not quite anger, not quite disappointment, but more like the realization that a part of your life you believed was yours had, in fact, never belonged to you. And in that moment, I understood something I had never considered before. I wasn't being pushed out of the house. I had never truly been in it in the way I'd always believed. And everything I had done, everything I had contributed, everything I had built, it all still existed. It just didn't exist where I thought it belonged. And what made that truth so hard to accept wasn't that it was wrong, but that it had been right all along, in a way I had never been able to see. After that moment, I was no longer searching for answers. I shifted into a state of observation. Not passively waiting for something to happen, but actively looking at everything that unfolded each day with a completely different understanding. During the day, I still worked, answered emails, and attended meetings as usual. In the evening, I still cooked dinner and sat across from Ethan Cole as if nothing had changed. But in between those very normal periods, I started going back to the data that I had never looked at so closely before. Every bank statement, every small money transfer, every bill, every old contract. And what caught my attention wasn't a large number or an unusual transaction, but the way everything repeated in a very steady rhythm that you would never notice if you weren't looking for it. I started to see a repeating pattern, not right away, but gradually, as the small details began to fit together. When a sum of money appeared at the exact moment a change was recorded on paper. When a seemingly normal expense was perfectly placed in a sequence I had never seen before. And I realized that the problem wasn't in one specific transaction, but in the direction of all of them. The money always moved in one direction. No deviations, no missed beats, nothing random. It was as if it were being guided by something that had been calculated long in advance. Meanwhile, life on the outside continued as usual. I still snapped my laptop shut before he entered the room, still smiled at the right moments, still nodded when I needed to, still asked just enough questions to keep the conversation from feeling forced. And that very normality became the perfect cover for what was happening inside. Because I didn't need to change his behavior. I needed him to keep everything exactly as it was, so I could see the entire structure without interruption. And the longer I watched, the more I understood that this wasn't an impulsive decision, not a mistake, but a deliberate arrangement, built step by step, over a period long enough to become normal in the eyes of others. And then there came a point when all the pieces were enough had to form a complete picture that I no longer felt like I was discovering something new. Instead, I was simply confirming something that had existed all along. And in that moment, one thought became clearer than any data I had reviewed. He wasn't hiding it. He just assumed I would never look. And when you realize that, nothing is a secret anymore. It's just a matter of time before you decide what you're going to do with everything you've seen. As everything I had observed and cross-referenced began to lock into a clear structure, I, Naomi Bennett, realized the problem was never just about a house or a single decision. It was about how the entire system had been arranged long, long ago in an order that you would never see unless you looked closely enough, because each part, standing alone, looked reasonable. Assets held in other names that didn't attract attention. A loan that remained in both our names, which no one questioned. Expenditures that were properly recorded, but no one ever looked at in their totality. And that's why it could all exist for so long without being discovered. Not because it was hidden so well, but because it was placed in spots where people don't think to look. And when I laid it all out side by side, what emerged was no longer a series of random events, but a complete system. I was still present in it, but only on the obligation side. I was still on the loans, the financial responsibilities, the legal ties, but I was completely absent from the ownership, the decision-making, the control. And it wasn't an obvious removal, but a very subtle shift, just enough that I wouldn't notice right away. Just enough for everything to continue operating as normal in the eyes of others. And in that exact moment, when I understood how it had all been constructed, I also understood something I had never been able to name before. I wasn't simply losing something. I hadn't just been cut out of a house I once thought was mine. Deeper than that, I had been placed outside the very control of the life I had helped build. And that feeling didn't come as an explosive shock, but slowly, with absolute clarity, like a truth you can no longer deny once you've seen it. 12th Fur, I didn't lose a house, I lost the right to exist within my own life. And when you understand that, it's no longer a story about assets. It becomes a story about your place within the very things you thought belonged to you. And that is when everything starts to change in a way that no one else can control for you anymore. As I continued to trace the data I had, not to find new evidence but to better understand how everything had been built, I began to realize that what I was seeing wasn't the result of a single decision, not an impulsive act at a specific moment in time, but a process that had spanned years. It was carried out one step at a time, small enough to not cause alarm, consistent enough to not create suspicion. And that's why it could exist right in front of my eyes without me noticing. Because each change seemed reasonable on its own. Each step could be explained away with a very normal reason, and only when I put them all together did I see its entire path. I started looking back at milestones I'd never thought were connected. The times we signed papers when I was busy with work. The periods when Ethan said he'd handled something so I wouldn't have to worry. The funds that were transferred at times when I didn't ask questions. And gradually, one thing became clearer than any single detail. This didn't just happen recently. It had started long before I even realized something was wrong. And the deeper I went, the more I saw that no step was random, no detail fell outside of a prearranged sequence. And right there, in seeing the entire timeline instead of just individual moments, I understood what made it all so much harder to accept than any other truth I'd uncovered. Because the worst part wasn't what had happened. It was when it had all begun, how long it had been going on, and the fact that I had been there, living through the entire process, without realizing it. The worst part wasn't what he did, but when he started. And when you understand that something was built over many years, you also understand that it can't be broken by a single immediate reaction. It requires a different approach, a different level of patience, and decision you can't make if you're still looking at everything as a single event instead of a complete system. Once everything was clear enough, I no longer saw this story as a problem to be explained, but as a system to be properly handled. And I, Naomi Bennett, understood that if I reacted in the usual way, if I confronted Ethan Cole directly, if I turned everything I knew into an argument, I would fall right into the script he had prepared. So I didn't do that. I took a step back, not to ignore it, but to see the entire structure from the outside. And from that vantage point, I began to build my plan. Not to win back what had been moved, but to make it impossible for the entire system to continue operating in the same way. I found a completely independent lawyer. Someone who didn't know me, didn't know Ethan, and had no connection to anything that had happened before. Because I needed a perspective unclouded by emotion or personal relationships. At the same time, I organized all the evidence I had gathered, not by feeling, but by timeline. Every single change, no matter how small, was placed in its correct position so that when someone looked at it, no lengthy explanation was needed. They could see exactly how everything had been constructed. And the most important thing wasn't that I knew what had happened, but that I understood the weakness of the system Ethan was relying on. Because any system, no matter how carefully designed, always has points where, if you apply the right pressure, it can't move another step. And right there, in understanding exactly how it all worked, I realized that I didn't need to win in the way people think. I didn't need to get anything back from him. I didn't need to prove I was right with words. I just needed to ensure one single thing, that from that moment on, nothing could proceed without my presence. Polythfer, I didn't need to win. I just needed to make it impossible for him to. By that point, everything was ready in a way that required no further explanation. And I, Naomi Bennett, understood that my plan didn't need many steps, didn't need to be complicated. It just needed a single action, in the right place, at the right time, and precise enough to touch the core of the system Ethan Cole had relied on for so long. So I didn't wait any longer. I filed a legal inquiry regarding the discrepancy between the property ownership and the loan obligation, a detail that had existed for a long time, but had never been put under the right light. And as soon as it entered the system, everything began to react in the way I had predicted, not with a sudden explosion, but slowly, steadily, and irreversibly. Procedures were halted, next steps were no longer approved, transactions couldn't be completed. Everything was held in place, not by a specific person, but by the very rules that had previously allowed it to function. And the suffocating feeling didn't come from something breaking, but from the fact that nothing could move forward. It was as if the entire system had suddenly lost its ability to move. And when you've believed that everything is running smoothly, having it grind to a complete halt is harder to accept than any single failure. And it was during that time, as everything was stalled in a way that no one could push it forward, that Ethan began to realize something was no longer the same. He started coming home earlier than usual, not with overt anger, but with a restrained tension, something that was searching for an answer it couldn't yet name. And when he walked into the living room, his gaze lingered on me longer than necessary, as if for the first time he wasn't seeing the person he'd been so familiar with all this time. But a different version, one he was no longer sure he understood, Taltfru. And that was the first time he looked at me like I was someone he couldn't read. There was no shouting, no accusations, just a single question spoken more slowly than usual, as if he himself wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. And it was the silence that followed that made everything clearer than any words ever could. Because once the process had been set in motion, there was no going back to how things were. And we both understood that, just in two completely different ways. After everything was triggered, I didn't have to do anything more to push things forward. Because from the moment the system began to respond, the outcome no longer depended on anyone's words or feelings. And I, Naomi Bennett, wasn't standing there as someone trying to win something back, but as someone who understood exactly how things worked. And when you understand that, you don't need to apply pressure. The structure of the problem itself applies the pressure for you, step by step, in a way no one can interfere with. The transactions were frozen. The carefully laid plans could not proceed. The paths that had always been open were now closed, casually, without noise or drama, but with absolute finality. And the most significant thing wasn't that an asset was blocked, but that the entire ability to control its flow was no longer in Ethan's hands. Because before, he didn't just control the paperwork. He controlled how everything moved. He controlled the timing. He controlled the decisions. And that was precisely what had given him his advantage all this time. But when everything came to a halt in exactly the right place, when each next step could not happen without my presence, that advantage ceased to exist. Not because I took it back directly, but because the system no longer allowed it to. And in that moment, the shift wasn't about the property, but about each person's position in this whole story. Because I was no longer the one standing outside the decisions, and Ethan was no longer the one who could manipulate the outcome to his will. He didn't lose the house, he lost control. And when a person loses control of the one thing they've relied on for so long, everything else begins to rearrange itself in ways they can no longer predict. After everything that happened, once things had settled where they belonged, and there was nothing left to prove, I, Naomi Bennett, no longer saw this story as a conflict between two people. I saw it as a process in which I learned to see things more clearly, not all at once, but gradually, through every small detail I had once overlooked. And if there's one thing I understand most clearly after all this, it's that anger isn't what leads you to a solution. It's just a signal telling you something is wrong. And if you stop there, if you react immediately, you just end up doing what the other person predicted you would. But when you step back, when you give yourself time to observe instead of react, you start to see what's really happening beneath the surface. And that's when you can make a conscious choice instead of being dragged along by emotion. And trust. Something I once thought was so clear, something that either exists or doesn't, is not actually like that at all. It isn't broken in a single moment. It's altered gradually over time, through the small details, the times you choose to look away, the times you choose not to double-check, until one day you realize that what you believe in no longer matches reality. And that's why understanding trust, again, isn't about going back to the beginning. It's about looking back at the entire process that led you to where you are now. And finally, what changed me the most wasn't what happened, but how I look at the traces everything leaves behind. Because nothing ever really disappears. No action is ever completely without a trace. It's just a matter of whether we see them or not, whether we have the patience to piece them together. And when you start to see things that way, you understand that what other people think they're hiding from you is really just what they never thought you'd pay attention to. The truth never disappears. It just waits for you to be ready to see it. If you've stayed with me this far, maybe this story isn't just about me, Naomi Bennett. Maybe, on some level, it touches on something very familiar in your own life. It doesn't have to be a house or legal documents. But that moment you start to realize something isn't right anymore, but you're not quite ready to face it. And you choose to trust one more time, and then one more time, until it becomes impossible to ignore. And maybe the real question isn't about what happened, but what you would do if you were in that position. Would you react immediately, or would you step back, observe, and wait until you understood the entire picture before making a move? If you've ever been through a situation where you realized things were not what you thought they were, leave a single word in the comments. No long explanation needed, just one word, so you know that you are not the only one who has ever seen it. And if you want to hear more stories that are quiet, but change the way you see everything, you can follow the channel. Because there will be many more stories, each one starting out very ordinary, but ending in a way that will make you never see life the same way again.